For years, I lived with a quiet ache that no one seemed to notice. It wasn't a physical pain or a loud, dramatic conflict. Instead, it was the subtle sting of absence. The absence of invitations, the absence of acknowledgement, the absence of family. The parties, the birthdays, the holidays, they went on without me. It felt as if I was a ghost in my own family's life, present in name only, but invisible in spirit. Each year, the silence around those gatherings grew heavier, and with it, the sense of being forgotten deepened. I remember the early days when I still hoped things would change. Maybe they just forgot to invite me. Maybe it was an oversight. Or maybe they thought I was too busy. But the pattern repeated itself again and again, and the excuses began to sound hollow. The message became clear. I wasn't important enough to be included. It's a crushing realization, one that chips away at your self-esteem and leaves you questioning your worth. You start to wonder if you're the problem, if you did something wrong, or if there's something inherently unlovable about you. What made it worse was the way these exclusions were often brushed off or denied when I confronted family members. "You should have called," they said. "You're always so busy. We didn't want to bother you." But the truth was, I wanted to be there. I wanted to be part of the laughter, the stories, the moments that define family. Instead, I was left with my own company and the sound of celebrations happening somewhere else. The silence was deafening. It echoed in the empty spaces of my apartment and in the quiet moments before I went to sleep. It was in the missed phone calls that never came, the social media posts filled with smiling faces, and the invitations sent to everyone but me. It wasn't just about parties. It was about feeling excluded from the very fabric of the family that was supposed to be my support system. This kind of exclusion can feel like a slow, invisible form of rejection. It doesn't leave scars you can see, but it leaves wounds that bleed inside. You learn to mask the hurt with forced smiles and polite responses, but inside, you're breaking down. I became an expert at pretending everything was fine, but every unanswered invitation chipped away at my confidence and sense of belonging. I found myself caught in a painful cycle of hope and disappointment. Each time a family event came around, I'd hold on to a flicker of optimism that this time, things would be different. But when the invitations didn't come, the silence hit me even harder. It was a cruel game of emotional hide-and-seek where I was the only one searching. Over time, I realized that this pattern wasn't about me. It was about their own limitations, their inability to see me as an equal part of the family. Their silence spoke volumes. It said that they didn't prioritize me, that they didn't value my presence, and that their circle didn't have room for me. It was a painful truth to face, but a necessary one. That silence became a catalyst for change. It forced me to confront the uncomfortable reality that I couldn't wait around for my family to include me. If I wanted to feel seen, valued, and loved, I had to start creating those experiences myself. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine to define. In that silence, I found a strange kind of clarity. The absence of invitations was not a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of their choices. I learned that family is not just about blood ties, but about who chooses to show up for you. And if my family wasn't going to show up, then I would have to show up for myself. For years, I had been waiting for my family to remember me, to invite me, to make me feel like I belonged. But one day, something inside me shifted. It wasn't a loud epiphany or a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet, determined realization that if I continued to wait, I might be waiting forever. The moment I realized I had to take control was both terrifying and liberating. A turning point where I chose to reclaim my own happiness instead of hoping for someone else to hand it to me. That morning started like any other. I was scrolling through my phone, seeing pictures from a party my family had thrown without me again. The smiles, the laughter frozen in time on the screen, contrasted painfully with the emptiness I felt inside. I thought about calling someone, saying something, but the words stuck in my throat. The usual feelings of sadness and rejection welled up, but beneath them was a new, stronger emotion: resolve. I remembered all the times I had made excuses for their absence. They're busy. They didn't mean to hurt me. Maybe next time. But deep down, I knew the truth was different. No more excuses. No more hoping for invitations that never came. I realized that I was responsible for my own joy, my own sense of belonging. Waiting for others to include me had only left me isolated. That day, I made a promise to myself. I promised to stop waiting in the shadows and start living in the light. I promised to create the moments I wanted to be part of, whether or not my family showed up. It was a decision born out of self-respect and a deep desire to heal. Taking control meant many things. It meant stepping out of the victim role and embracing agency. It meant acknowledging my pain, but refusing to be defined by it. It meant opening the door to new possibilities, new relationships, and new celebrations that I could shape. Most importantly, it meant loving myself enough to give myself what I had been waiting for all along: recognition, joy, and connection. I started small. I reached out to friends I hadn't seen in a while, invited neighbors over for coffee, and allowed myself to feel worthy of their time and company. Every interaction built a little more confidence, a little more hope. The more I took control, the more I realized how much power I had been giving away by waiting for my family's approval. This wasn't about revenge or bitterness. It was about reclaiming my life and rewriting the narrative. I wasn't going to let exclusion define me or dictate my happiness. Instead, I would be the author of my own story. In the days that followed, I began searching for a place to call my own, a physical space that symbolized my independence. Buying a house wasn't just a financial decision, it was a statement. It was saying to myself and to the world that I mattered enough to create a home filled with love, warmth, and celebration. That moment of realization, the day I decided to take control, was the first step toward freedom. It was the moment I stopped waiting for my family's invitations and started inviting myself to life. At first, solitude felt like a punishment. When the parties went on without me, when my phone remained silent on holidays, and when my inbox held no invitations from the people who shared my last name, the loneliness wrapped itself around me like a cold, unwelcome blanket. I didn't choose to be alone. It was the result of being quietly pushed aside. But over time, that isolation transformed into something unexpected: strength. It didn't happen all at once. The early days were hard. I spent too many nights sitting in silence, staring at blank walls, wondering what I had done wrong. I replayed conversations in my head, analyzed old arguments, and searched for reasons that might justify why I had been so consistently excluded. It was exhausting. But eventually I grew tired, not just of waiting or wondering, but of giving so much mental space to people who gave me none in return. So I turned inward. I started asking myself questions I'd never dared to consider before. What if being alone wasn't the enemy? What if this solitude could be a beginning, not an ending? It wasn't easy to shift my mindset, but it was necessary. For the first time, I began to treat myself as someone worth investing in. I began small. I took myself out for walks, left my phone at home, and listened to the world around me instead of obsessing over the digital snapshots of lives I wasn't invited into. I started journaling, not about what I had lost, but about what I wanted to gain. I read books that reminded me I wasn't alone in this experience. One of them, The Art of Solitude by Stephen Batchelor, shifted something deep inside me. He wrote, "Solitude is not a state of withdrawal from the world, but a place where we can learn to relate to it more fully." That line stayed with me. I realized that I didn't have to fill the quiet with noise. I could embrace it. I could use this time to discover who I was, separate from my role in a family that had failed to see me. I learned to cook for myself, not quick meals to fill the void, but beautiful dishes that took time, care, and intention. I lit candles in the evening, played music that made me feel alive, and began decorating my small apartment like it was a sanctuary, not a waiting room. It was during this season of solitude that I began to imagine a different future. I saw myself in a space that was truly mine, a home that reflected who I was and who I was becoming. Not a temporary fix, but a permanent shift. I started saving money, learning about mortgages, and visualizing what that house might look like. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about building something for myself. The journey to independence wasn't just financial, it was emotional. I had to let go of the idea that family meant automatic inclusion, that love always comes from blood ties. Instead, I started recognizing the chosen family around me. The friends who checked in, the coworkers who invited me for coffee, the neighbors who waved and smiled. They weren't flashy relationships, but they were real. They reminded me that connection is everywhere if you're open to it. I began to understand that independence doesn't mean shutting people out. It means not depending on them to define your value. I wasn't bitter. I was evolving. The more I embraced solitude, the more I realized how little I truly needed the validation I'd once craved. I had myself, and that was enough. That strength in solitude became the foundation for everything that followed. It gave me clarity, stability, and the confidence to pursue things I'd once considered out of reach. It was in that quiet, often painful, but ultimately liberating space that I stopped surviving and started building a life that was fully mine. Buying a house had never been part of the original plan, at least not so soon. I always assumed I'd do it eventually, when I had a partner, when I had help, when my life looked more complete. But life rarely waits for perfection, and in my case, the need to create something of my own came from a place of deep necessity. After years of feeling excluded, forgotten, and peripheral in my own family, I no longer wanted to exist in borrowed spaces or temporary arrangements. I wanted a home, something rooted, something permanent, not just walls and a roof, but a statement. I am here. I matter. I belong, even if it's just to myself. The decision came slowly but firmly. I had already begun the inner work, learning to live in solitude, discovering who I was without needing anyone's approval. That shift laid the emotional groundwork for what would become the biggest and most empowering step I'd ever taken. The idea of owning my own home felt both exhilarating and terrifying. There were moments I doubted myself. Would I be able to afford it? Was I being impulsive? Was this some form of emotional retaliation disguised as real estate? But the more I sat with it, the more I realized this wasn't about anyone else. This was about me creating a space where I didn't have to ask for a seat at the table. I could build my own. I threw myself into the process with both fear and fire. I met with mortgage advisors, researched neighborhoods, looked at listings with wide eyes and cautious optimism. I remember walking through homes with a mix of awe and disbelief. Me? Buying a house? It felt like stepping into someone else's life, one where I was the protagonist instead of the supporting character. I was used to being left out of the story. Now, I was writing it myself. One afternoon, I stepped into a modest 2-bedroom house with light pouring through the windows and an old tree swaying just outside the living room. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't grand, but it felt right. I could already see the dinner table in the corner, the couch by the window, the laughter echoing off the walls. Laughter I would bring in myself. It was peaceful, warm, and completely mine. I made the offer that same day, and when the deal went through, I didn't cry from stress or fear. I cried from something deeper: relief, pride, joy. I had done this on my own. Moving in was both a logistical nightmare and an emotional rebirth. I painted the walls myself, chose every piece of furniture, carefully unpacked boxes that held the story of my life. But the most important thing I placed in that house wasn't physical. It was the sense of ownership, not just of the property, but of my story. For the first time in a long time, I felt seen, even if only by the reflection in my own mirror. This house became a symbol of everything I had reclaimed: my independence, my strength, my right to be included, not by someone else's choice, but by my own. I started hosting small dinners, inviting friends and neighbors, letting laughter fill the space that once held only silence. I filled the walls with art that inspired me, with books that had healed me, and with memories I was finally choosing to create. This wasn't a house built on resentment or loneliness. It was built on growth, healing, and the quiet power of starting again. Buying my own space didn't fix everything. It didn't erase the years of exclusion or suddenly mend family wounds, but it marked a shift. It was the first chapter of a new story, one where I stopped waiting to be invited and chose instead to welcome myself home. I had spent months preparing my home, not just physically, but emotionally. Every room I painted, every lamp I installed, every pillow I fluffed carried with it the weight of my journey. Years of exclusion, quiet pain, and newfound independence. But as I stood in the center of my living room on the morning of my housewarming party, I felt something new: anticipation. Not anxiety, not regret, but a calm excitement. The kind you feel when you're finally about to do something for yourself without asking for anyone's permission. This party wasn't just a gathering, it was a declaration. A celebration of everything I had built on my own terms. The guest list wasn't long, but it was intentional. No one was there out of obligation or blood ties. They were there because they saw me, appreciated me, and had been part of this new chapter of my life. I invited coworkers who had become close friends, neighbors who had offered small kindnesses, and a few people from my past who had shown up when no one else did. These were the people who had earned their way into my world through empathy, consistency, and genuine care. This time, I wasn't sitting by the phone waiting to be invited. I was the one setting the table. The day of the party was sunny, like the universe itself had approved of what I was about to do. I cooked as much as I could on my own. Nothing extravagant, but all made with intention. I made space for laughter, for conversation, for the kind of human connection I had once assumed was reserved for others. And slowly, as people began to arrive, so did the realization. I had created something beautiful. Not just a party, not just a house, but a life that felt whole. There was a moment, midway through the evening, when I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. I was holding a drink, laughing with someone who had become like a sister to me, and for a second I didn't recognize the person I saw. Not because I looked different, but because I felt different. I looked like someone who belonged, someone who wasn't waiting anymore, someone who had stopped trying to earn a place at someone else's table and had instead built her own. As the night went on, stories were shared, music played softly in the background, and people moved freely through my home as if it had always been a gathering place. A friend leaned over at one point and said, "This feels like the kind of party people remember." I smiled, not because I needed validation, but because I knew it was true. Not because of the food or the decorations, but because of the energy, the warmth, the authenticity, the quiet joy of seeing someone reclaim their space in the world. What struck me most was how natural it all felt. There were no awkward silences, no performative gestures, just connection. Real, sincere connection. And I realized that what I had longed for all those years wasn't just a seat at the table. It was to be surrounded by people who truly saw me, who didn't forget me, who didn't need an excuse to include me. One of the final guests to leave that night was an older neighbor, a retired teacher who had taken a liking to me since I moved in. As she put on her coat, she touched my arm and said, "You've built something special here. Not just this house, but a sense of home. That's rare." Her words stayed with me long after the dishes were washed and the lights were turned off. That housewarming wasn't just a party, it was a rite of passage. A final shedding of the old narrative that said I wasn't worth remembering, that I didn't belong. In its place, I wrote something entirely new. A story of self-worth, resilience, and joy born not from being invited in, but from finally opening the door to myself. After the party, after the laughter faded and the house returned to its quiet hum, I found myself in a place I hadn't expected, standing at a crossroads between reconciliation and release. For years, I had carried the weight of being excluded, overlooked, and quietly dismissed by the very people who were supposed to know me best. I had done the hard work of healing, rebuilding, and redefining my sense of self without them. But now that I had created a life of my own, the question echoed louder than ever. Do I try to rebuild those broken bridges? Or do I let them burn and keep walking forward? The morning after the housewarming, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and replayed the evening in my mind. I felt proud, really proud, for the first time in years. Not for proving anything to anyone, but for proving something to myself. I had found connection, community, and joy on my own terms. And yet I couldn't help but wonder if any of my family had seen the photos that guests had posted, or heard through some distant grapevine that I had finally thrown a celebration of my own. A celebration they weren't part of. I didn't feel angry anymore. That was the strangest part. The resentment had slowly unraveled as I built this new life, replaced by something softer. Maybe sadness, maybe indifference, maybe just clarity. I wasn't sure. What I did know was that time had passed. And with time came distance. And with distance came perspective. I had spent so long trying to earn a place at their table, only to realize they hadn't set one for me in years. Still, the idea of reaching out lingered. Maybe a conversation, maybe a letter, maybe just one message to say, "Here I am. I've grown. I'm okay." Not as a plea for acceptance, but as a form of closure. For them or for me, I wasn't sure. I drafted texts in my head, imagined what they might say and how I might respond. But every scenario ended the same way. Not with resolution, but with a quiet emptiness. A reminder that some gaps aren't meant to be bridged. I began asking myself deeper questions. If they suddenly wanted to be part of my life again, would I even want that? Was it forgiveness I was craving, or simply acknowledgement? And did I need either to move forward? The answer, though it took time to admit, was no. I didn't need them anymore. Not in the way I used to. That realization was both empowering and heartbreaking. I had always thought closure would come from their apology, their realization, their change, but it hadn't. It had come from me. I didn't make any grand declarations. I didn't write them out of my life or post dramatic statements on social media. I simply stopped waiting. I stopped hoping for their messages, their invitations, their attention. I focused instead on nurturing the relationships that had grown around me, the ones I had cultivated with care and intention, my chosen family, my people. Sometimes moving on doesn't mean closing the door with force. Sometimes it means letting it stay slightly ajar, knowing that if they ever walk through it, they'll find a version of me they never took the time to know, but one I'm deeply proud of. And if they never do, that's okay too. In the end, I chose peace. Not the kind that comes from reconciliation, but the kind that comes from release. I didn't rebuild the old bridges. I built new ones, to people who showed up, to parts of myself I'd forgotten, to a life that no longer revolved around being remembered. I stopped trying to fix the past, and instead chose to live fully in the present. It took years of silence, one courageous decision, and a house filled with new laughter to realize that the love I had always been waiting for didn't need to come from others. It had always been mine to give. If this story moved you or reminded you of your own journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your voice matters here. Share your experiences in the comments. This is a space for those who felt left out and decided to stand tall anyway. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We're building something real together, one story at a time.